For the third time in about 100 years now, Europe has broken into rashes, and in the process, a fever seems to be now overtaking the entire world. We had mentioned to you earlier that both world wars before now have taken place because Europe was not able to handle its own instability, its own internal differences. Everybody tends to blame Asia, Africa, third world, fourth world, etc., etc. But the world wars begin in Europe. Now the world is facing a similar sort of a prospect. This is also bringing about a lot of changes and a lot of questioning and debates within Europe too. And it's also made us all that much more curious about Europe, European security, the issues in Europe. The fact is that most of the generation who we called millennials, most of them were born after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So the understanding or memory of where Europe has come from, where it's headed, and what's this question, NATO expansion or non-expansion, what were the commitments made to Russia, what is it that Russia is insecure about, say in Ukraine and other places, so what the hell is going on? So we'll go into all that, but before I do all that, I will just read out a quote for you. This quote is from Thomas Klein Brockhoff, who is the respected director of German Marshall Fund at Berlin. And I have this quote courtesy of a climate change energy expert, Laurie Milliverta, who we've quoted a few times in the past on climate change discussions. He says, Thomas Klein Brockhoff says, Germany's business model of getting security from the US, energy from Russia, and markets in China frayed in the last 48 hours. So that is a very good explanation for what state Europe finds itself in right now. But also before I go there, let me also tell you, while the Germans, I presume, will sort out their own business model because Germans are Germans and a lot of the world needs something from Germany, they'll be able to sell it. And Germans are business people first, so they are quite smart. Let me also tell you, make my little appeal, that we also have to have a business model for the free media in India. And just as Germany might have things which are very useful to people across the world, we also in the free media do things that are useful to our people in India and people of Indian origin or those interested in India, even if they are not Indian, living overseas. So once again, it's an appeal. Please pay for your news. Please pay for good journalism. Take a paid subscription. If you haven't done so, if you have done so, please renew it because it's your money. If you are able to send somebody to say Russia or Ukraine tomorrow, that will only be if we are able to count on you for your money. So please do contribute. And also, the last time I had made this appeal about a month back, some friends of the print cautioned me that it sounded like my tone was that of a little admiration. Maybe I was just appealing too hard. So once again, with folded hands, please pay for your journalism. It is good for any democracy. It's good for all of India. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we disagree, but it's good for all of us. Now, back to this NATO question. What is Putin saying? Putin को गुस्सा क्यों आता है? Putin को गुस्सा आता है. Putin says, I am furious because they are expanding NATO eastwards. So when you look at the map of Europe, when you say expanding eastwards, it means Western Europe is pushing into Eastern Europe. And he thinks that NATO has come too close. And the fact that after 2014, when he thinks he carried out a punitive expedition on Ukraine by snatching away Crimea from it, so he thinks that that punitive expedition was not enough, that since then, instead of learning to respect the Bada Bhai or Big Boss or Big Daddy or whoever in the neighborhood, Ukraine actually has been dreaming of becoming more European, becoming part of EU and most importantly NATO. And Volodymyr Zelensky, who's the current ruler until as long as he is of Ukraine, he has been talking strongly and openly about joining NATO. That comes too close for comfort. That is what Putin is saying. So Putin is saying, this is my own area of influence. Leave it to me. Don't push me any further. And I will also explain to you how is it that he thinks he's being pushed deeper and deeper by the Western European powers, helped along by the Americans. Now, his view also is, or his argument, that commitments were made to him and to other Russian leaders that NATO will not expand eastwards or not expand to former Soviet republics. Now, there is a lot of evidence that tells us that that is perhaps not true. Now, what is the truth of that? So, we have to look at some facts. We will not take a call on what is the truth and what is a lie, but we will just mention some facts for you. And these facts come from Gavin E.L. Hall, who is a political science and strategic affairs academic at University of Strathclyde. And I am quoting from his article in the conversation, of which I will share a link with you. Now, he says that after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, there is no real commitment anywhere that NATO will not expand. In fact, if anything, evidence of the first decade or so is exactly the opposite. In fact, even on the 25th anniversary of the breakdown of the Soviet Union and end of the Cold War, Mikhail Gorbachev in an interview said that he saw no threat in NATO expansion becoming anti-Soviet at any point of time. He did not worry about it, although he said in that interview that enlargement of NATO is a big mistake in retrospect, because it is against the spirit of our 1990 Accords after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Now, when Soviet Union broke up and the Cold War ended, in fact, there was no agreement signed between what remained of the Soviet Union, that is mainly Russia, that was the core, and NATO or any other forces. In fact, the only agreement signed at that point, or the first agreement between Russia and the Western countries, was what is called as Treaty of Final Settlement with respect to Germany. And this was in December 1991. This treaty said that no non-German NATO forces will be kept in what used to be East Germany. And similarly, no nukes will be parked in East Germany. That deal has been kept as yet. That has not been violated. In fact, in the same year, Russia also joined what was called the North Atlantic Cooperation Council. That had Russia, or whatever was left of Soviet Union, and NATO countries. So it's not as if the post-Soviet Union entity of Russia was moving away from North Atlantic states. So many of the East European countries, which used to be members of the Warsaw Pact, which was led by the Soviet Union, they were now itchy about becoming more formally involved in Europe and NATO. So they signed in 1991 February something called the Visegrad Declaration, and this was signed by Czechoslovakia, Poland and Hungary. And in that declaration, they pushed for much greater integration with Europe. Now, this was going on, and these former Warsaw Pact nations were also not scared of Russia anymore. That a few things happened in 1993. For example, there was an attempted coup in Moscow. There was Chechen War. There was also Russian help to the breakaway South Caucasian Republic of Abkhazia. Now, all this began to worry these former Warsaw Pact members. It was also around this time that a kind of partnership for peace was set up by the NATO and others, because NATO was not yet very keen to get the new states in, because NATO also was having a lot of internal debate. So they set up something called Partnership for Peace, which became a kind of a pre-NATO alliance, which was joined also by two Central Asian republics, that is Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. In 1983, once again, Yeltsin wrote a letter to Clinton, where he said in his letter, any possible integration of East European countries into NATO will not automatically be anti-Russia, right? In 1997, the members of the Visegrad Declaration, three of them, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, they were admitted to NATO at the Madrid summit of NATO. Slovakia was made to wait for a year till 1998. Many of these countries had their referendums on the question. In fact, if you look at Hungary, and in all the countries, overwhelmingly, the population voted to join NATO. In fact, Hungary, the percentage was 85.3% in affirmation of joining NATO. Now, it was at the same Madrid summit of NATO that the NATO-Russia Founding Act was also signed. So once again, Russia and NATO had a perfectly good relationship right now. There was no insecurity in Russia, and it did not seem, even looking at it from NATO and from whatever has come out of NATO thinking and NATO members, that they saw a threat in Russia and need to contain Russia. This was around time when three former Soviet republics. Now this is a fundamental change. These are not former Warsaw Pact members. These are three former Soviet republics. That is the Baltics, that is Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia. So they signed up what was called the Baltic Charter of Friendship with the US in 1998. Russia actually helped them along instead of being insecure by settling its border issues with Lithuania. In 2002, NATO-Russia Council was set up, which frankly has kept on meeting since then. It has not even been affected by what's happened in Ukraine. Its last meeting, in fact, was on 12th of January this year, irrespective of whatever had happened in Donbass by then. So this history is more complex than it's made out to be. Now, what is it that changed? If Russia seemed to be so comfortable with all this, and NATO was expanding, and one after the other, East European countries were joining NATO, Baltics, former republics had joined NATO, and now there might have been a prospect of Ukraine joining NATO. How did Russia get so worried about it? The only question is, there's only one difference between the past and now, and that difference is just the name of one person, that is Vladimir Putin. Because it was one Russia before Vladimir Putin, then it began to change. And in fact, if you listen to his speeches, he seems to be saying that. He says that we were pushed around when we were weak, and he says Soviet times, Soviet breakup times we were weak, Iraq war we were weak, Yugoslavia operations we were weak, the breakup of Yugoslavia, we will not be weak anymore. So the big turning point is the rise of Vladimir Putin. Now you might also be curious about NATO, and everybody knows, you can Google it, that NATO was formed in 1949 after the Second World War, when the US-led powers were looking at shaping the world in their own image. And by that time, Cold War had already begun to build. In fact, Cold War had pretty much started on the day the Second World War ended, because Berlin, Germany, etc., they got divided. Now, in 1947, America came up with what is called as the Truman Doctrine. So Truman Doctrine was to contain Russia politically, militarily, diplomatically, in any which way. And 1949, NATO was formed with 12 members, but until then it did not have such a strong military character. It's only after the war in Korea that NATO acquired a more military character. Now, between 1948 and 2014, in fact, America has signed 66 different security pacts with many nations. And I will tell you about some of those, particularly those that we in India might be interested in. And these include with countries like South Korea, Thailand, Japan, the Philippines, Australia, Liberia, tiny Pacific islands, which used to be formerly under American control. So America also signed agreements with them. In 1980, the Americans created a new category, a completely new category called Major Non-NATO Allies, MNNA. Who are the members? Alphabetically, Afghanistan, Argentina, Bahrain, Egypt, Israel. Even Israel is an MNNA, not a NATO member. Jordan, Kuwait, Morocco, New Zealand, and remember, Pakistan, it still remains an MNNA. Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine. Now again, Georgia, Moldova will be a cause for pain for someone like Putin, for Russia under Putin. Obama later also wanted to extend these to Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia and UAE. Now look at Pakistan. Pakistan in 1954 signed with the Americans a Mutual Defense Assistance Program, MDAP. Later in the same year, Pakistan joined Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. Now that had many of the other Southeast Asian nations like say the Philippines, for example, Thailand, countries like that. Then in 1955 came Baghdad Pact. That was again a Western-run, Western-oriented, Western-led security pact. Americans were not a part of it. It was a British-led pact. So between 1904 and 1955, Pakistan had joined pacts led by America and led by Britain. And these pacts confirmed Pakistan to be a Western ally at the peak of the Cold War. So Baghdad Pact included Britain, Turkey, Iran and Iraq, besides Pakistan indeed. So can you imagine Iran and Iraq were in one alliance at that point. But later Iraq pulled out, and because Iraq pulled out, you couldn't call it Baghdad Pact anymore. It got the name CENTO, which is central treaty organization. Now, NATO itself, I told you, it had 12 countries to begin with. It had Belgium, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, UK, and the US to begin with. Greece and Turkey joined it in 1952. Just because you're members of an alliance doesn't mean that you stop fighting or you won't fight in future. So Greece and Turkey are at grave odds right now. So Greece and Turkey both joined NATO in 1952. Germany came in 1955. Spain in 1982, because we know that General Franco lived on for a long time and the fascist rule then ended. So Spain became a member in 1982. And then in 1999, Czech Republic, Hungary and Poland. These were the three Visegrad Declaration countries. They became members. Then Bulgaria, the three Baltic states, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia joined NATO in 2004. Then Albania, Croatia in 2009. All these countries, remember, all these countries were earlier in the Soviet sphere. They were either members of Warsaw Pact or de facto Soviet allies. And also in 2017, the joinees were Montenegro and North Macedonia, which had also come up as a result of the breakdown of Marshal Tito's Yugoslav empire. And although, just as an aside, let me mention to you, Alexander the Great, although generally people think in the folklore that he was Greek, he was actually a Macedonian. So his homeland also became a member of NATO for whatever it's worth in 2017. On which note, I shall just tell you a little factoid and conclude this episode of Cut the Clutter. For a long time, the Greek ambassador in India did not have a residence. So he used to live in a suite at the Oberoi Hotel in Delhi. And that suite was called the Alexander Suite. And then all these changes took place in Europe and Macedonia went out, and Macedonia actually protested, saying that Alexander was a Macedonian. How can the Greek ambassador's suite be called the Alexander Suite? So that tells you when regions change, when history changes, all kinds of interesting things happen. And that is precisely what's happening with Europe's security structure as well.